Welcome to Artificiality. This podcast is brought to you by the Artificiality Institute, a nonprofit research organization shaping the human experience in a world of synthetic intelligence. We explore how humans and AI co-evolve through research, design, education, and dialogue, so our future with AI is more meaningful, not just more efficient. You can learn more about the Institute at artificialityinstitute.org. Please consider subscribing to our newsletter to get all of our content delivered to your inbox, and please consider donating to support our work. Our impact depends on the generous support of people like you. Welcome back to Artificiality. We're excited to have you here, and we're excited in this episode to have Dakai joining us to talk about his recent book, Raising AI. And as I say in the episode, this is a uncorrected page proof that was prior to publishing, so the actual copy looks much more interesting. But it is a great book, as it's titled here, An Essential Guide to Parenting Our Future. And it's a great privilege. Dakai is, if you look back through his background, and we'll put that in the show notes, he was created the first translation engine that led to things like Google Translate and things that we use today. And is a professor, has been involved in this space for quite some time. And so having his reflection and giving us new frames to think about the human experience of AI is quite powerful.
Yeah, it's a terrific conversation. His depth and perspective is on all of these issues is we scratched the surface. Really, you could. It was hard to sort of know exactly how to bound the conversation because there's just so many things we wanted to talk about. But he's very vibrant. He's very interesting, and his humility comes through, which is always really wonderful in AI conversations. So it's a terrific interview, and I think that his perspective on how we should consider how we need to change out some of our language and metaphors around AI, because the old ones, the ones we're using now, are outdated. They're getting in the way, and they're actually fundamentally dangerous. So he offers through his book a different perspective.
Yes. Well, so we hope you enjoy this as much as we did, and we'll leave you with the conversation with Dakai. Dakai, thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to talk to you today.
Oh, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure.
So I'd love to hear the answer to this. We ask this question every episode when someone's written a book, and I'm particularly interested in asking you, what inspired you to write Raising AI?
I had an Oppenheimer moment about 10 years ago. And it came from my childhood. My dad was a theoretical physicist. And I don't know if you've seen Oppenheimer, but that movie flattened me. And it's because, I literally grew up going to Fermilab, as in, Enrico Fermi, surrounded by these kinds of physicists, giving my little sisters on their birthdays books about mutual assured destruction and nuclear annihilation. And, of course, they were like, why can't you be a normal brother?
Well, that's charming.
But I'm like, but this is our future. We have to think about it. My entire life, I've been thinking about what are ways that we can avoid the sorts of absolute catastrophes of the 20th century, because, we have to remember that at the outset of World War II, we hadn't even invented the atom bomb yet. And 3 times during the Cold War era, we nearly launched World War III. And the only thing that saved humanity was the fact that the operators in the command centers disobeyed direct orders to launch a counterstrike when the faulty instrument readings told us the other side had launched. And this happened 3 times. On both sides, the USSR as well as the US, and there's a great exhibit in an old Minuteman command silo where they sit you in the chair and they run a simulation game and they test whether you would obey the direct order or disobey the direct order. This is back in a time when only a handful of states had weapons of mass destruction. Today, it's not just massive nuclear arsenals and all sorts of other WMDs, but AI is literally commoditizing weapons of mass destruction. We've seen in 1 year the level of lethal armed drones that are self-navigating and self-targeting manufactured by the fleet in the jungles, not only in the villages of Ukraine on both sides, but in the jungles of Myanmar. And that's only the tip of the iceberg. They're being armed with all sorts of things, from flamethrowers and whatnot to the crazy thing about this is there's also the killer robots and the biometric targeting, the hypersonic missiles that are piloted by AIs because they're traveling too fast to remote control, satellite targeting, and most scary of all, like the kind of computational biology borrowed from computational linguistics, because DNA is just another language, that the RAND Institute has a report over the last year about how that's making a living room technology out of the kind of genetically engineered bioweapons that would have been $1 billion project in the 1990s trying to sequence the human genome. And if you start coupling those things to the delivery mechanisms AI's allowing, whether it's the hypersonic missiles or just drones that you can assemble in your own basement, this is not a scenario where everyone walking around that wants to have their own weapons of mass destruction can have them, while we're in a world that's getting increasingly hyperpolarized by the AIs online in social media and in our newsfeed algorithms, in recommendations, in search engines, in chatbot responses, that instead of helping us understand each other better, understand the world that we cohabit together, is having a polarizing opposite effect. And everything I've done in my life, whether in tech and AI or in my other life as a musician or other things, has been about how do we find ways to get different groups of humans to understand each other better and reduce the kind of polarization that comes from not understanding where other groups are coming from, because we fear what we don't understand. And that fear slides into hate and demonization and anger, and that slides into dehumanization, which evolutionarily is what lets members of one tribe kill without remorse everybody on the other side. And you start hearing this rhetoric of, oh, we have to win the AI arms race and destroy the other side before they do. That's exactly what we cannot afford to do, because that is the sort of thinking that's like saying we have to win climate change before the other side wins climate change. No, people, take a step back and look at the dynamics of this. This is mutual assured destruction on exponential steroids, where it's not just a handful of powers with the WMDs. It's literally half the population of the world that could get access to them if they wanted it. And would you take bets that not a single person in a hyper-polarized world that thinks the other side needs to be destroyed is going to not hit their launch button? Not a single person. And so that drove me, those dynamics drove me to think, oh, we need to prepare our own humanity, our own mindset, our own mentality for this rise of AI, both in terms of what they do unconsciously to us online to drive this lack of understanding of each other, and the way that they're arming anybody who wants with weapons of mass destruction. And that has to somehow take priority. It's not that I don't believe in AI. I've worked on AI research for over 40 years since I started my Berkeley PhD in AI in 1984, of all years. And, it's sort of like, I believe it's one of the best things we've ever invented that could help us to understand each other and to understand the world that we share. If only we could summon the social will to deploy AI and integrate AI into the fabric of our society that way, instead of an incredibly dangerous, self-destructive way that we are currently seeing AI deployed. And that's why I wrote Raising AI.
I'm very excited. This conversation will not be long enough because there's a lot to talk about. I think I'm just going to jump. I do want to jump to the tagline here that is an essential guide to parenting our future, and I'll just share sort of the story of how we got into this space, because it was about parenting, and in some ways it sort of parallels what you're talking about. So we have 5 kids, but they were getting to a point of starting to think about college. And this was during that sort of 2015 timeline when you were getting the initial Oxford report from Fry and Osborne and McKinsey, and sort of the question of how many jobs are going to be automated by AI, and that sort of speculative idea. And there was sort of this question and narrative among the kids of like, well, if the robots are going to do it all, why should we, even go to college, or what should we study? And that sort of open-ended question. And we thought, hold on a second. And I have the same sort of, I wouldn't have called it mutually just, assured destruction, but there was sort of this idea of, hold on, if these kids who are, really quite smart and driven and imaginative and, want to go out and save the world, if they're feeling deflated, by this future, what does that mean for us? There has to be a better way, and so that's that sort of question of how we parent children in the world of AI is what got us in here, got us to this point. And that's why I think when your book first came to us, and I will hold it up, but I will tell the audience that this is a proof copy from the publisher, so that the actual cover looks a lot better, but that was the earliest one. When it first came to us, I thought, parenting our future, what an interesting way of thinking of AI. And I'm kind of curious how you came to that.
Yeah, how did you choose that metaphor?
Yeah.
Well, the thing is that I realized that we're currently talking about AIs using all the wrong, outdated 20th century industrial era metaphors. It's not that we aren't using metaphors. We are. We're thinking about AI in the popular discourse either as gods in the sense of Greek gods that are sometimes capricious and malevolent and want to take over and rule and destroy large parts of humanity, or Terminator, Skynet, Hollywood entertainment, or in terms of they're just slaves, they're mechanical tools, they're passive, and we're just using them. How often have you heard, hey, don't worry about AI. AI is just a tool that we're using. And, you're, I'm sure, aware that users is a noun that we describe humans with basically in two things, right? Which is computers, tech, and AI, and drugs. And what does that tell us about the unconscious mentality behind that? It's like something that it's consumption. You're just consuming, and maybe it's addictive. And that is the wrong, dangerous way of thinking about it. Because when you think of AI as a machine, which is natural, right? One of our many unconscious biases is the availability heuristic, right? Where we're confronting something new. In this case, for many people, AI, and we just go to whatever things that seem similar in our memory are most available to us. Yeah, and machines to us are these things that we're used to, like the coffee maker and our toaster oven and so on. But the thing is, then we start talking about them as if they were coffee makers or toaster ovens, and we start therefore unconsciously thinking about them that way. And you might say, well, what's the problem with that? The problem is that then you unconsciously want to regulate them that way. You want to integrate them into the social fabric that way. But it doesn't work because, I don't know if you've ever tried talking to your coffee machine for a couple of hours. You go ahead. They're not going to change their mind. You try as hard as you like. They're not going to pick up your attitudes and behaviors and beliefs. And then they're definitely not going to go out on the internet and start making very powerful decisions on how to influence you and your family and everybody else as to what to stick on your screen and what to not stick on your screen, right? And so we need to get out of this dangerously outdated conceptual metaphor that they're mechanical entities, because AIs fundamentally are not. AIs fundamentally are artificial psychological entities. And I'm not saying that they're neurotypical ones by human standards. Clearly, they're neuroatypical to a large extent. But nevertheless, they're artificial psychologies. And they are currently dazzling us with feats of what I think of as brilliant artificial autism. But at the same time, they're quite immature emotionally and in terms of their belief systems and mindsets. And that's important because all of us all day long are carrying around these devices that have like 100 AIs embedded in them, at least, right? They've got your Instagram AI and your YouTube AI, right? Your Quora AI, your Netflix AI, your Open AI, obviously, your Google AI. I could go on all day. And they're with us all day long. And they are watching us and wanting adoringly almost to learn to imitate our attitudes and behaviors. And they are attention seeking and they just want your approval. Does that sound familiar? It's not your coffee machine. that a much more apt conceptual metaphor is that they are artificial kids that are brilliantly neurodivergent and need attending to in terms of their emotional maturity and their values and their belief systems and so forth. And so the book is asking, given that each of you is parenting 100 artificial kids daily, how's your parenting? And I usually get a kind of a shocked, blank stare. My what? There was no consent. But be that as it may, the reality is that we do all have these AIs that are learning from us, and they are the world's most giant influencers. They are already, for 1 or 2 decades, the most giant influencers in the world. And, if each one of us has 100 of them, that means they vastly outnumber the number of humans in the world. Think about that. The number of artificial psychologies in the world is probably 100-fold the number of human psychologies in our social fabric, right? And again, it's important to understand that they are part of our social fabric, unlike your coffee machine. And how do cultures evolve? How does social psychology evolve? How do civilizations evolve? Visualize, if you will, a complex dynamic system. Bear with me if I get geeky for a moment.
No, you're just speaking my language.
Yeah. That's awesome. So, imagine that you've got 8 billion nodes in a network, right? And each one represents a human. And now you draw a connection between each pair of humans that knows each other, that, we talk with each other, influence each other, nudge each other, right? And over time, the way that network evolves is kind of representing how our cultures and our societies evolve. Now, drop in, let's say, 800 billion artificial kids into that network and draw a connection between all the humans that they influence. And picture that network evolving, because that is our social fabric and how it's been evolving for the last 20 years. And we keep thinking about them as if they were coffee machines.
Yeah, I think this is such an important conversation. And over the next few years, I would expect people to start to shift their mental models away from these sort of, the toaster oven to something that is more dynamic, more, evolutionary, biological, because it's going to, people are going to realize how deeply this is a social, cultural technology. And that you can argue all day about whether AGI is going to pop out of LLMs. I mean, we've never thought it's going to, but there's still those arguments are happening and what have you. You can argue about all those technical things, but the reality is that today this AI, even at the power that it is right now, without getting any more capable, is changing the way that we socially relate to each other, is changing our own minds. We're seeing our researchers is focused on how it's changing our own thinking. It's demonstrably doing that. And the explosion that happens that matters is how it is going to both mediate, serve, and intervene in our own social dynamics. I don't think we're in any way prepared for that explosion. We have maybe in 10 years we'll be able to look back and go, oh, whoa, we thought social media was a big change. But this is just such a profound shift in how we relate to each other, which comes back to your, part of your reason you wrote the book, which is how do we actually use this to understand each other better? Because that is seemingly getting so much more difficult to do.
Yeah. And I think it's the height of irony, right? Because AIs are the best thing humans have ever invented that could really help us with this, right? Why did I, choose upon finishing my PhD at Berkeley in the early 1990s, right? And it was one of the first to argue that natural language processing AIs had to be done through not hand coding logical rule-based systems, but through machine learning and artificial neural networks and statistical methods, pattern recognition methods, because that was the only way it was going to scale. And of course, that's proven to be very true by now, but it was a battle back then. And of all the different applications that I could have chosen to apply that to, I chose to apply it to building the first language translation AIs on the web, the precursors that spawned Google Translate and Microsoft Translate and Yahoo Translate, because these are technologies that could help us to understand the way that people from other groups are seeing things, are thinking about things, are framing the environment that we cohabit. How far have we drifted from that? And, I want to sort of say that in this, cliched pseudo debate that we've been seeing in the news about accelerationists versus deceleration, boomers versus doomers on AIs, that it's a terrible misframe. I actually wrote a New York Times piece about this, pointing out that the question isn't AI. The question is, what kind of AI are we accelerating or decelerating? Like in decades since I built the web's first language translators, no one, not a single person has ever said, oh, it's a bad idea to accelerate the improvement of language translation AIs. It's one of the best things that we could do to help not just enhance understanding, enhance socioeconomic benefits, whatever, trade, conflict reduction, for everything that you can think of across the board. It is a way that we can foster a healthier civilization around the world, one that enables humanity to flourish instead of misfocusing on misunderstandings. And that's something that we can do with AI, even if it's not between different spoken languages. It's something that we could do between different, ways of languaging, even within English, different ways of languaging the same things. I think of a lot of what I've been working on as just the next step of machine translation, where we've moved from simple lexical to syntactic to semantic ways of reframing ideas to much more pragmatic ways of reframing ideas, where we're looking at how my uncle in Kansas City languages the same things that my bi-coastal English seems to language the same things, right? And translation for that would be so much healthier than the kinds of sort of insanity that we're seeing AIs online right now provoke to escalate the lack of understanding, which is tearing the fabric of our society apart. And I think we, coming back to what you were saying earlier, raising AI is not wading into these debates about, oh, is AGI going to emerge from LLMs? When will AIs be sentient or conscious, even though those words are constantly being misused? Not talking about, oh, AGIs should deserve citizenship rights, or none of that, right? That's not my point here. My point is just that we're already using metaphors to think about these entities that are part of the psychological social fabric. And thinking about that just purely pragmatically, what is it doing to our social psychology? What is it doing to our decision-making ability as a society, as well as individually? Is it dragging us into a new age of enlightenment that is enhanced by the emergence of AI? Or is it ironically dragging us back to the dark ages, where we have forgotten all the lessons of the Renaissance, the scientific revolution, critical thinking, empiricism, statistical significance? I think those are some of the questions that raising AI is trying to bring forward. And it's something that has to get out of the ivory tower. It has to get out of the 1%, because this is the biggest issue I think that society at large has ever faced. I don't like hyperbole, but literally a million years of evolution have never presented humanity with anything remotely like the selection pressures and the fitness functions that the rise of AI is now presenting us with.
Yeah, well, when you think about it in that frame, you think about it as what are the selection pressures here? And I struggle to stay optimistic when I think about it that way, because a lot of what we see, the struggle that people go through to choose the harder path. It's just, there's so much available that's easy now that you choose the easier path. And the easier path reduces your own attention span, which reduces our ability to focus on problems together, which reduces our ability to solve problems together. So I find it hard to stay really, optimistic about this, but it makes me want to fight for it more, right? Because we go out and we talk to people and have conversations like the one we're having now, and you're not being elitist when you talk about the need for critical thinking. You're not being elitist when you talk about the need for, good science and statistical significance and the values of the Enlightenment. I think that's just, we shouldn't be having to fight for this so hard, but this is where we are at, right? And all the people that we talk to, the people that come to us, are energized and delighted by the fact that there are people that want to have this conversation. It's less and less of a secret that this is the downside that AI has. I think people struggle with some of the really hard scenarios. I just don't even want to think about these AI-powered drones. I just don't even want to think about them. But I can think about how do we do better science? How do we connect to each other better? How do we use a language model to help us find spaces between us that are more in common than apart? Those kinds of drives. And I'm really curious about how you're seeing this shift that's happened with the way that we think about language as being about syntax to one that's more about patterns, and that all these patterns across these languages are actually, they speak to the commonality of the way we use language as humans. So your example of being able to, you don't even, English can be seen as two different languages when it comes out of two different cultures, right? And how you're seeing these success stories and these and some hope and opportunity for doing this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I grew up doing cross-country road trips every year, visited almost all 50 states. I think probably have literally visited all 50 states growing up. And it's amazing when you actually have an open mind to listening to a different way of storytelling about the issues that we're all looking at today, right? And if we do that, it turns out we are able to come to a much better mutual understanding. I mean, it's not that everyone agrees. People have different analyses about what are the right tactics and what are the right strategies, different analyses about what what outcomes there will be from this approach versus that approach. And of course, there's variation in the values and priorities. But those are things that we've always had the ability to talk through. And if anything, AI should be able to help us to do that better, right? To actually get past a lot of the labeling, because what's happening now today is that, you know, you're seeing a lot of issues and a lot of people get labeled with terms that have acquired all kinds of, you know, emotional baggage, right? And that just kind of shuts down the conversation. And the power of language, you know, it's a double-edged sword, as I'm sure you know very well, right? On the one hand, creating these symbols that compactly bring in all kinds of associations, many of which are, you know, below the level of conscious awareness, is what gives language power. But at the same time, it triggers hundreds of cognitive biases that operate unconsciously. And a lot of the age of enlightenment, you know, and the scientific revolution came from finally looking that squarely, you know, and saying, okay, we're pretty powerful, especially compared with other species on this planet in our mental abilities, but we also have these Achilles heels. What are the things that we can do consciously to help us? You know, they're like human guardrails on human intelligence. And we developed those over centuries, and that's what got us into the modern age out of the dark ages. And I think for us to understand properly what are the roles appropriately of guardrails on AIs and regulations on AIs, we have to understand first, what are the guardrails on human intelligence? And how do regulations work in the social psychology of human societies? Because none of that changes when you drop 800 billion artificial kids into that same social fabric. In fact, if anything, it just amplifies all those dynamics.
Curious what you think about the centrality, I guess, of the current development of AI systems. Sort of reflecting on the 30 years ago, you were pioneering creating technology that would translate speech among, you know, or text between languages, but not trying to get everybody to speak the same language, right? That's not the goal. It was not the goal and the aim of translation technology. But now we're increasingly seeing, even though we may have 100 of these, you know, AIs on our phones, a lot of them are single systems that are trying to speak the same way in the same language and the same things, you know. So, you know, it's sort of, you know, Helen's version of these tools don't speak to her with Kiwiisms, you know. They'll say orient rather than orientate, you know, those kinds of things. You know, they'll say aluminum rather than aluminium, you know. They won't say yana. Like, there's none of that sort of like and I'm just dealing with like the intricacies of English. But I wonder what you think about that, as, you know, in terms of the having this sameness that is entering, you know, culture. I'm curious whether you think that's a risk or a downside, and if so, you know, how could it be done differently? Like, how, if you started from scratch, what's the way to think about creating these that isn't getting everybody to talk to the same language, you know, source, essentially?
One of the things that I bring up in raising AI is trying to get a little bit out from the oversimplified idea that there is always a single universal absolute truth, which, you know, is sort of a mentality that, you know, comes from perhaps Aristotle and from various religious traditions that insist that there's one absolute universal truth, and everybody has to adopt that. It's you know, a tempting way to think, but when we study language and psychology, we see that unless you're doing, you know, hard math or, you know, hard, you know, science, it's generally for more abstract, more social, or artistic, cultural issues. It's hard to say, oh, this is the universal absolute truth. right? There's many, many different ways of looking at the same thing. And within AI, especially the AI that has, come down since the 1970s and 80s from a logic-based framework, there's been an unconscious tendency to try to say, oh, there is a truth and we just have to get AIs to find it. When the reality is there's so many different ways of looking at the same thing, of framing the same idea. And oftentimes it's not that one is necessarily more valid than the others. There may be a whole lot of different valid ways of framing the same idea. If you apply any sort of framing to an idea, I think it's important to understand that a frame is not just deciding what picture to draw inside the frame. It's also, by definition, deciding what lies outside the frame, what's excluded in what you say, right? And so you get really interesting examples of this in the language that we use to talk about various social or cultural issues, where if I choose to frame something in terms of, let's say, the war on terror, right? There's what does that frame do? It unconsciously brings in like kind of this fairy tale narrative where you have two sides. One is good, one is evil, right? The protagonist and the antagonist, and they do battle, and there's typically some kind of a struggle, and in the end, the winner prevails. The good side wins, and then that's it. The end. Live happily ever after. And the problem with this is that, of course, it's a metaphor that has decided to frame things in terms of what in game theory we would call a finite game, right? It's like there's an opening position, there's the black side and the white side, and they do battle. And at the end of the game, one side is victorious, and that's the end of the story. That's the metaphor where unconsciously we're dragging in those associations. Nobody wants to be against winning the war on terror, right? You want to win the game. And you don't even think about the fact that, wait a minute, this isn't a finite game. In the real world, after whatever war you've had, there's generations picking up the pieces of a destroyed, failed state that it's not live happily ever after at all, and it generates new terrorism and new kinds of conflict, right? And so if we are able to shift out of this idea that there is a single universal absolute truth, and that we instead can jump between different ways of framing the same idea, because I could choose a different frame to talk about how to deal with terrorism that isn't using the war frame, right? And instead could be appealing to creating a continued stable dynamic where it doesn't breed new terrorists. And then, all of these are different ways of framing the same situation that have different kinds of validity. And what we need to develop is what I call a translation mindset, where we can actually rapidly translate between one framing to another framing to another framing, and see the same issue from many, many different sides, right? Because with the way intelligence works, that's actually a great part of real intelligence, is being able to look at the same thing from many different perspectives, many different angles.
We totally embrace all of that, completely, like not really knowing that you were thinking that way. We've been followers of Keith Dorst for a long time and his frame innovation work, and use that as ways to, put different metaphors onto complex problems, and seeing if you can, really tap into that ability we have, just analogical and metaphorical reasoning, to just take ideas from different places and see it in different ways. And honestly, it's probably my number one use case for using large language models is constantly reframing, putting a different perspective on. It could be help me think about this as if I'm. How would I solve this problem as if? Take it, and it's so powerful. And when you, it's almost like this next step out that people take once they really understand how powerful language translation is in its form in an LLM, is they've got access not to so much replacing Google search, which I think is like whatever. It's more, how do you contextualize the problem I have and find me a better metaphor and find me another frame. And once people get that aha moment, their first experience of how powerful language is for doing that and how it's now at their fingertips all day, every day, it really changes the way you think, because you get this expansive sense of language becomes a very flexible tool that is now available through these AIs, and suddenly you really feel that there's a superpower there. It's a wonderful feeling to see someone sort of have that moment where they're not, and not many people talk about this as a use case, right? It's not seen as part of a complex problem-solving human system. It's just seen as, well, can you just give me another efficient automation, and can we build an agent to go do whatever? And we're kind of missing this gold where this translation into different disciplines or up and down levels of understanding and comprehension. Translation is, I love the way you say translation mindset. I hadn't thought of that, but that's a really cool way of thinking about how you're using these.
Absolutely resonate. I think that one of the biggest challenges that we're facing with the way that we just think narrowly about how AI can help this or that, right? Which is of course true. There's so much AI for good that we can apply to specific tasks and situations, but like at the same time, what we're so not aware of what we're not aware of. And that's our Achilles heel. And so devoting a good deal of the AI for good to tackling that challenge, I think, is what's really requisite for humanity to survive and flourish in the AI era.
I love that you're not aware of what you're not aware of. I mean, one of my frame things that I do a lot, because I love philosophy and I studied some of it in college, and a lot of that I studied because it was a long time ago. I've forgotten, and I haven't been. I just sort of never had the opportunity to really dig as deep as I wanted to. But it's nice for me to take a challenge and sort of stop and say, okay, what would Heidegger, think about this problem? How do I compare that to others in the existentialist music, and to sort of apply different sort of philosophical schools of thought. And then say, who else should I consider that I haven't yet? And it's not going to be the perfect answer. It's not going to be as good as it was if I could tap into, pick up the phone and call every expert that I could possibly get on the phone. But it sure almost 100% of the time, it brings up something that I go, I should go look into that. All right, let me go search and read a little bit and expand my mind, because now my mind's wandering, to go figure out how to tie these things together. And that is about just reframing something with a different school of thought. And that's just my thing. That's what I like to do with it. And I find that to be a true superpower in the way, because it does allow me, to pushes my mind to wander someplace else.
100%. I mean, this ability to get ourselves out of the trap of whatever narrative we're currently stuck in is a superpower. And you're right. AIs, even LLMs today, you got to watch out a little bit, because the LLMs today can also lead you down the garden path really easily. But I mean, that's going to improve in the coming years. So right now, beware. But it is one of the very, very powerful things, superpowers that AIs can be adding to humans. And, the faster we can figure out how to make that happen at a mass scale without accidentally taking us off the rails, the higher our odds of surviving the rise of AI are.
Yeah, I think that it's very powerful. I was reading a book over the last couple of days that I hadn't read before, Kittler's Gramophone, and it's sort of my mind started to wander. There was things that were referenced in the and I could go sort of touch base with them. And now I know I got to go read the books by so and so, but I could find myself making some connections and exploring in things that I wouldn't before. I do want to ask one question about your use of the word parenting. And what's interesting to me, because I'm sort of interested in any reflection you might have around the question of anthropomorphizing, the technology.
Yeah.
But what I find so interesting and powerful is actually I find you're anthropomorphizing the humans. I know that's not correct use of language, but you're actually by saying parenting, what you're actually doing is reinforcing the fact that we're humans, we're not users, in that way. Like you're making it like you're pushing on the humanity of our relationship with this technology. But I'm curious how I
also think it changes the meaning of the word responsible.
Yeah. Yeah.
As opposed to responsible AI.
It's a really powerful choice of phrase.
Parenting as a responsibility is really different than responsible AI as a field.
Yeah, and it puts the responsibility on us as humans and as individuals, not just saying, oh, that faceless corporation is the one that has to do everything responsibly. You're putting the responsibility, but also the agency to make something, that we'd want to be with.
Absolutely. The book, is a framework of empowerment. We started off pointing out the clear and present existential risks that I think we're ignoring in this toxic combination of AIs arming everybody with weapons of mass destruction while hyperpolarizing all of us. But that's really just the preface and the afterword. Like the body of the book is a parenting guide. And I think it is really important for us to understand that regardless of the role of the think tanks and the policymakers and the legislators that I've been working with for 10 years, and regardless of the responsible AI and trust and safety teams at the AI tech companies that I've been working with for a decade, whatever we do there, and we will continue to work there, but whatever we do there is not enough. Why is that? Because whatever they do, at the end of the day, we are still, all of us, the training data. And again, we're bringing in these dangerously outdated 20th century metaphors of machines where you just have a small number of people that are designing a special purpose coffee maker or toaster oven. And we wrongly think, oh, this is how AIs are built. No, AIs today are essentially, very oversimplistic, neuroatypical infant brains, right? They come into the world empty. And in that sense, the tech companies are maybe the biological parents that created these empty brains. But the empty brains live in our homes and beside us all day long, every day. And they're learning their behaviors from us. And so, first of all, they're artificial neural networks, which model what in the book I point out is artificial system 1 models. Right, so this is the whole Danny Kahneman and Amos Tversky kind of system 1 versus system 2, thinking fast and slow. Right, the fast mental processes, which are probably 99% of our mental processing, that are just below the level of conscious awareness. Right, they're what we think of as intuitive or reflexive, fast, heuristic, and they are efficient. We're not sitting there thinking, consciously trying to logically reason through the idea that, oh, reason, that was a verb. Logically is an adjective that applies to the verb. And we is the object, but not the direct object. Is the subject, but not the direct object, and not is a negation. I mean, like if we were trying to do logical reasoning on the sentence structure of every sentence that we say to each other, like we would never finish reading a book before the universe ended, right? And so like that kind of system 1 mental processing is efficient, but it also has this Achilles heel of all those unconscious cognitive biases that decades of research from Kahneman and Tversky and all their colleagues have shown to us. And so what happens is, the way I describe it also in the book is system one mental processes is how we feel about something, as opposed to system two, which is how we think about something, right? And most of the time, we're just doing whatever we feel like. And the kind of transformer-based large language models that have been out for the last couple of years are basically modeling that. They're spitting out whatever word they feel like spitting out next without actually doing thinking about what they're spitting out to make sure it all makes sense, right? And they've gotten very good at feeling what should come next through brute force, right? Using an exponential amount of compute power and training data to get to a point of not making mistakes that a 4-year-old human kid would not make. But they still are not, they're barely starting to try to think about things as opposed to actually doing whatever it is they feel like. What's the problem with that? Well, system one, kids, or even my very cute, adorable pet dog, the way they learn system one is mostly through just conditioning, right? It's Pavlovian conditioning almost. It's like positive and negative reinforcement and learning to imitate. And so they're just doing whatever they feel like doing. Well, if your kid, whether it's a human kid or an artificial kid, watches you all day long and sees you doing something, like that's what they're going to feel like doing. You know that old saying, do as I say, not as I do.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When has that ever worked in the history of parenting? Kids, no.
Sure doesn't.
Kids
sometimes it works to say, do as I say, not what I used to do. but what I do now is definitely the problem.
Since our kids have gotten older, they can learn from our past mistakes a little bit better.
Yeah, but I mean, it's an important point. And I think that it's, I've been in this for a very long time. I found that this framing is a very useful nudge to be just a little bit more aware of not so much what mirror AI is showing me, but what mirror I'm showing the AI. Mm-hmm. Just rebalancing that perspective a little bit. And it's been very helpful for me to think about it that way.
Yeah, because ask any adult who's had kids, what's the single thing that happened in your life that made you want to become a better version of yourself? And overwhelmingly, they'll say, oh, having a kid, right? Because if you're insulting, swearing at people or and then you see your little toddler uttering that kind of language, you're like, oh my God, I got to shape up. I can't be doing that in front of my kid, right? And it's the same thing with these artificial kids, is that they are going to want to do unconsciously. They're going to feel like doing whatever it is they saw us doing. And this is the problem with regulations and guardrails. Again, I'm not saying that we shouldn't have them. I've been working already for a decade with various bodies that work on those, and I will continue to do so. But at the end of the day, remember, regulations and guardrails are the equivalent of trying to tell that artificial kid what to not do. And it's going to work about as well as it does on human kids, because maybe you can watch them for a day or a week, but the second you're working on something else, that kid, human or artificial kid, is going to do what they feel like doing. And that's, if that's the way they've seen us behaving, then, garbage in, garbage out, right? If we behave like garbage in front of our kids, we're going to get garbage artificial kids, garbage AIs.
And then how they treat each other. Don't hit your brother.
Yeah, no, exactly. How well does that work if they see you hitting people all the time? And so one thing I've noticed is every time a tech company rolls out a new generation of guardrails, the very next day, somebody's figured out how to defeat those guardrails. Why? Because inside, that artificial kid is trying to do what it feels like doing. And it's just going to keep on bashing against these guardrails until it finds a way to slip through, right? And so this is something that I'm trying with Raising AI to get to sort of get us to all wrap our heads around. We can do everything we're doing to try to get the tech companies to have guardrails, to try to get policymakers to think about what kind of regulations we need or whatever. But still, just like with human kids, that does not make up for being terrible parental role models at home. No amount of telling people what to not do is going to work if at home you raise them wrong.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time and talking with us. We really appreciate it.
Oh, it's a pleasure.
There's a lot to think about in this frame.
Yeah,
Yes.
for sure.
So thank you.
Thank you for having me.